Okay, so I'm just gonna do this in one take because like I literally went through like editing, recording multiple takes and everything, and like it just sounded bad. Like I had no personality whatsoever. Like obviously my mic quality is not good, but I want this to be like a real video that I actually mean. So like I'm literally just gonna start reading from the script. I don't care. I know this is like super great way to open a YouTube video, but whatever. This is not going to be me going through every single confidant. It's not going to be a Persona 5 is garbage video, and here's why. Yeah, I'm a Persona 5 hater, but I'm not that kind of Persona 5 hater. So that said, I think that every single non-party member confidant in the game, with the sole exception of Yoshida, and actually with the inclusion kind of Futaba, it's broken on a fundamental level. Why? Because the character's problems end up being solved by Joker rather than the characters themselves. And this results in a cast of characters that lacks agency, at least enough for it to make a genuine impact on their own stories, and therefore the player. In this video, I'll only be using Kawakami as an example, because there's a lot of cringe and nonsense with her, but everything major that happens in the story has an equivalent, and or an equivalent with another confidant with this problem, and I'll just be skipping over the nonsense, so you don't have to deal with it. So, the confidant starts after Joker finds out that Kawakami, who's his homeroom teacher, has been moonlighting as a maid to make extra money. She says it's to support her sick sister, but it becomes increasingly obvious that she's hiding something. Like she's a terrible liar. It would be funny if it weren't really weird framing wise, but anyway. Um, a few years ago, she was tutoring this one student who was basically labeled as like a delinquent, a bad kid by the rest of the faculty because he would always show up and turn things in late and poorly and that kind of thing. But she found out that actually it was because he was supporting his family and he was just really overworked because of that. So she was like, okay, well, I'm a teacher. I care about my job. I care about my students. So I'm going to be tutoring this kid. And then, like, indirectly, because of that, he ended up being more overworked and ended up getting into a car accident. And the parents of that student never forgave Kawakami for it. So at the end of her confidant, Kawakami collapses from the stress. She ends up being hospitalized. Joker's there to like be like, "Oh no, what about that exam tomorrow?" And right when she begins to stand up for herself, refusing to give up any more money to the parents who come in to just to taunt her, basically, because Persona 5 doesn't know how to write believable villains until Maruki, but that's its own can of worms I'm not getting into. They threaten to expose her as a sex worker to the school, which would not only, like, very obviously result in her being fired, but it would basically end her career as an educator. Now, knowing that Persona 5 is all about rebellion and how sometimes it's best to put yourself at risk for the greater good, what do you think happens? Does Kawakami refuse to back down? Does she tell the parents that she's willing to put her job on the line if it means her exploitation is going to end? Does she explain the situation and share everything she's done to convince the higher-ups to not fire her when the truth does come out? Like, what do you think happens? Because what actually happens is Joker steps in, he goes to Mementos, and he erases all of her problems for her. Yeah. That's what happens. Kawakami then thanks Joker for being a phantom thief who helped her out, as if there was nothing she could have done herself. Now, you might be wondering why I have this problem when the metaverse is used during the main story as well. Well, this is because the metaverse and the phantom thieves themselves are not really representative of any real-world form of rebellion. It's also, like, let's be real, it's an urban fantasy. Those often have extractions or abstractions for real-world equivalents. That's pretty obvious too. But let me use an example. In Persona 3, the characters use evokers to make it look like they're shooting themselves in the head, and they do this to summon their personas and to fight shadows. The analogy that Persona 3 creates with this is the idea that in order to truly live, one must accept their own mortality. The Phantom Thieves' actions are likely intended to represent activist groups or like whistleblowers, but I honestly have a really hard time reconciling that with the fact that there are already confidants like Oya, who's a journalist, whose partner got like killed for basically whistleblowing, and Yoshida, who is a politician who obviously engages in activism, but they don't see nearly as much success. And like, yeah, to a certain extent, it's understandable because they are confidants; they're supposed to have problems. But at the end of the day, again, it's the metaverse that solves at least Oya's problems, and Yoshida doesn't really solve anything on a grand scale. His confidant is really about like just saving his reputation more than anything else. And so, is activism useful in the lens of this story or not? Because it really seems as though Persona 5 can only support the idea of activism and standing up for yourself when supernatural forces are involved. After all, sorry, voice crack. After all, getting people involved to speak out against Kamoshida didn't help. That's why there was like a billion hours of like failing to expose Kamoshida at first. When Shido confessed his crimes, the people did nothing, and this led to the party to decide to change the heart of every single human being, even though the metaverse literally just didn't work. But whatever, anyway. And this chain is only broken at the very end of the game, when, after failing to establish how it's possible, or even showing that it is literally at all, Sae and the others kind of promise to reform the broken systems that have been controlling people the entire time. And what results is a very strange and equally hollow message. Another thing is like Makoto at the end of her confidant, which, like, yeah, she solves her problems, but she also decides to be a police commissioner so that she can reform the police from the inside, as if that's even a remotely realistic or good message to send whatsoever. But anyway, not gonna get sidetracked. They just did her dirty, is what I'm saying. Some people might say that it would be boring if Joker did nothing to help the confidant characters, or that it would conflict with the themes of getting involved when you don't have to. But that actually is how the social links from Personas 3 and 4 worked. Like, yeah, they're not as overtly political, but in 3, each social link focused on a character's relationship with some form of death or mortality. So, for example, there's Maiko, she's a young child whose parents are in the middle of a really bad divorce. There's Akinari, who is trying to, like, leave his mark on the world and find his purpose when he has a terminal illness. Then Persona 4 has social link centered on the idea of truth and accepting yourself. So, Ai suppresses her insecurities and abandonment issues by being like, you know, how she is, abusing everyone. I love her social link. I'm just saying, like, goddamn girl. But then you have Ko, who thinks he doesn't belong with his own family, and instead of actually, like, talking to them, he makes assumptions and tries to find answers in places that really will not help him in the long run. So people often liken the protagonists of 3 and 4 to therapists because, they don't step in very often. They usually act as a shoulder to cry on. But this allows the characters to solve their own problems, like sometimes with the help of the main character, but it's always like more indirect. They're always the person who is motivating the changes in some way, or at least like actually making them happen. There is no moment where the protagonist steps in and fixes everything, only for it to be followed by the character dropping everything to thank the protagonist for making them realize what they literally could have on their own. And I'm really not sure where Persona 5 went wrong in this regard. Like, after all, every single party member but Futaba is able to solve their own problems. The writing follows the exact same formula of those previous games to a T. Ryuji Social Link even has a moment, optionally, where you can be like, okay, let's go to Mementos, and then he's like, no, actually, I don't want the others getting involved in this. And it's like, okay, that's not like the best justification, Ryuji, but I mean, your heart's in the right place. You're right about that. Now, why am I so fixated on this? It's simple. Without there being enough examples of it happening in text, Persona 5's confidant writing utterly fails, and breaks the like actual idea of it portraying the game's core messages. Sorry, I'm tripping over myself because this writing is terrible, and so is my script. I'm sorry, I apologize. I'm not perfect. Now, of course, like the game's themes aren't completely broken in this way, but when all but one of your non-persona wielding characters is able to improve their own lives through their own confidants, not having Joker solve things for them, in a game that's over 100 hours long, there's a massive problem that cannot be overstated. Now, Persona 5's true ending, which is also Royal Standard ending, involves the ex-Phantom Thieves driving Joker back home, and along the way, they plan on helping people in the same manner that they helped those who sent Mementos requests in the past. So the game is acknowledging that, like, ideally it is possible to solve your problems without magic. However, how are they actually going to do that? They haven't learned how to do that. The game has completely failed to establish that one's problems can be solved without magic, even 50% of the time. And that's by far my biggest problem with the game overall. Pretty much everything else is relatively minor, optional, or like mostly easy to ignore, like the very ridiculous transphobia, the homophobia that's turned into like drag queen phobia in like Royal's English version. I'm not getting into that bullshit. But in spite of everything I've said, like the game still conceptually means a lot to me. It literally inspired one of the first like original stories that I actually wrote myself. But that's because of its concepts. It's not because of their execution whatsoever. The game is an inconsistent, unfocused set of stories that is made to appeal to the lowest common denominator. It knows what it wants to say, but it doesn't know how to do it, especially with the respect that the topics deserve. Its side characters are meant to make the player feel better about themselves, rather than them being mechanisms by which to share meaningful and inspiring stories. And I know, like, I get that these are very aggressive ways to put it, and I'm not trying to take anyone's enjoyment of the game away, but I really do want people to think more critically about the media that they consume and what they're actually saying. Like, not just the emotional responses that they call forth. Like, you can like a work, but that does not make it good. Just like you disliking one does not make it bad or problematic. This entire video, by the way, is only my reading of the game, obviously. It's possible I completely missed something, or that you disagree with my conclusions, or whatever. And yeah, I really don't have like a concrete conclusion paragraph, so I'm just gonna end it. Thanks for listening. Bye.